Thank you, Tom. Some of you may have received a group email yesterday that said Gary Allen was going to be here tonight, but he couldn't make it, so you stuck with me. I want to thank you folks for coming out here tonight. I appreciate it very much. And welcome to the Lawrence County Museum, although this is an event sponsored by the Revolutionary War Museum in Simpsonville. Lawrence County Museum is not charging anything tonight for your attendance, but there are some donations. There's a donation jar downstairs that if you feel inclined to, please contribute. There's also some membership forms down there if you want to join the Lawrence County Museum. It's a good growing concern. Tonight I'm going to talk, or my genre is history, obviously, but I'm going to divide it into three parts. I'm going to talk, have some brief comments about land ownership, and some brief comments about surveying, and then a brief history on the development of townships in the colony of South Carolina. And I use the word brief because if I didn't, we'd probably be here all night, because to me it's a very interesting subject. So I want to ask you a question, and I want you to go back in time to maybe your 9th or 10th grade year in school. And the question is, what happened in the year 1492? Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Let's give the man here a peppermint. All right? That's right. That is a tremendous date, and I'm going to use it for before and after reference that year. The idea of land ownership in Europe was completely different from what we know or experience today. Land ownership in Europe during the time before 1492 and after was considered in political terms. There were kingdoms, there were territories, there were nations. A ruler or a monarch or a knight might claim ownership of the land, but the common folk, and I include myself in that, had no opportunity to own land. This concept of individual land ownership was unheard of during this time. If you have read and remember the story of Robin Hood, the fictitious story of Robin Hood, how did he become, or how was he declared an outlaw by King John? He was hunting on the king's land. He was killing the king's deer. So this idea of individual ownership was not in existence at that time. But then Columbus sailed and made his voyage. And what we've learned about the indigenous people of North America at that time, they had similar ideas as the folks back in Europe about land ownership. The North American people called the Delaware, their reference or their observations of the land, they lived in it. The Miami people passed through the land. And the Iroquois occupied the land. These were people groups indigenous to this continent. And the idea that an individual owned the land did not exist with them either. This idea of land ownership by an individual, thinking that land would be a commodity, that can be traded, borrowed against, or speculated on would require a fundamental shift in the thinking of the people at the time. And that shift in thinking began in the year 1538, just barely a generation from Columbus's discovery. There was a gentleman in England named Sir Richard Benese, and he wrote a book, and that book is titled, "This book shows the measuring of all manner of land." Very plain and simple title. But the key word in that title is measuring. When land is measured, it gets value. Pieces of land became units of economic value. Also, land was being measured by a system known as metes and bounds. Some of you may have already heard of that. Have you know the system of metes and bounds? For those of you that don't, I have not heard of it. My property meets Mr. Smith's in the north by that big stand of oak trees. My property is bounded on the south by Wilderness Creek. So metes and bounds is how property was defined during this time. Even with that, there was still no measurement for area size, square footage. Even today, some of our modern land deeds reference metes and bounds. It's still accepted as a means of measuring and locating land. You can look on your land deed that you have, and it's going to have the name of the property adjacent to yours, or it's going to have the name of the highway that fronts your property. Those are the modern day metes and bounds. But we still needed a system or something that would allow us to more accurately measure the land. While that was being developed, and these landed nobility wanted to make sure that their land was still under their control, they would hire an individual and give him a job title called overseer. And what he would do would be walk those metes and bounds. And in the Middle Ages and around the time of Columbus, when they would walk those boundaries, if anyone was on the property that did not belong there, they'd run them off. So this job of overseer would walk those boundaries. In France, that title of overseer, when translated into French, the root word is surveyor. In 1620, the means to measure land very accurately and give it a specific value was developed. It was developed by a man named Edmund Gunner. And remember that name, it's going to be on your test tomorrow. But Edmund Gunner invented a chain, and I'm going to drop it on the floor, it'll make a noise. This is called Gunner's chain. It is the workhorse for the surveyor. He made his chain out of metal, and he made it 66 feet long. Anyone want to take a guess why he picked 66 feet? Huh? It's a multiple of rods. Now, do you want a peppermint or you want to take a chance out on the grab bag? Huh? How about this? But he made the chain 66 feet long because that is the length of 4 rods. So what is a rod? Literally, it's a wooden pole, 16 and a half feet in length. There are many explanations of why 16 and a half feet. One of the most interesting and humorous is that King James, the one that authorized the translation of the Holy Scriptures, called in his advisors and said, look, men, we need to have a standard unit of measure. So y'all figure something out. Well, one of the advisors went to Sunday morning church, and when he came out of the building, he saw a group of men standing there. And the thought occurred to him, why not line them up, heel toe to heel toe, and whatever distance that is, we're going to use it. And it was 12 men, turned out to be 16 and a half feet. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know, but that's one of the stories that goes around. Okay? But 16 and a half feet is 1 rod. Edmund Gunner made his chain 66 feet. Now, if you stretch this chain out 10 times, that's considered 1 tally, T-A-L-L-Y, 1 tally, 660 feet. Now, if you stretch it out for 8 tallies, that's 1 mile. So surveying was labor intensive. You needed manual labor. And if you're in an open field, you can do that quite easily. It's just time consuming. But if you're in a wooded area and you have to keep a straight line, you got to clear what is known as the line of sight. So it can be very strenuous work. And in George Washington's time, a surveyor got paid $2 a mile. And he had to pay his help out of that. So this is the workhorse of the surveyor right here. Now, this is another tool that the surveyor would use. This is a reproduction of a Rittenhouse compass, surveyor's compass, 1795 is what it. Now there are different variations of a compass. So when I purchased this one, I was being a little economic challenged, and so I didn't get the most expensive. You're looking at about $850 right here. Rittenhouse, R-H-I-T-T-E-N house, Rittenhouse. He was a contemporary of Benjamin Franklin. He and his brother made scientific instruments during that time period for a living. That's what they did. Like I said, this is a surveyor's compass. Some of them have little beads on them where when you get 1 tally, you slide it over. When you get 2 tallies, you slide it over so you can keep count. Some of them have a level on them, a water with an air bubble in it, bubble level, to keep it level. Why would you want to keep it level? Because your needle on here needs to float freely. You don't want it to be rubbing against the glass on the top. And after this is over, you can come up and look at it. I'll leave that. These vertical pieces here are sight vanes. You have a hole here which expands your view, and once you get a particular object in view, then you can refine that with the narrow vertical slit here. And of course, it has the windrows mounted on here, 360 degrees. So the surveyor would choose the direction that he wanted his laborers to work in, and they were called chain bearers. And there were 2 of them. You had to have 2. Now, you could have a third one, and he would be chopping limbs and moving brush out of the way. But they would stretch this chain out starting directly beneath the center of this compass. Now, I've got a plumb bob, but I didn't put it in here. But a plumb bob would hang down by the string, and that would be the starting point on the ground like that. The other tools that the surveyor would use that the chain bearers would carry are called chaining pins. And the little ribbons on this so that they can find it in the grass. And they would only use 11. Now, he may have spares that he would keep back at camp or something, but they would only use 11 while they're working. The first pin would go in the ground right next to that plumb bob. That'd be the starting point. They would stretch the chain out. This guy on this end would yell the word chain. The guy on the lead end would hear that, pull it tight. And then he would say mark, and he would put the pin in the ground. And they would repeat that process, stretching the chain out, putting a pin in the ground. The guy in the rear would pull the pins up. After they had placed the next one in the ground, he would pull the one up that he was at. And when he collected 10 of them, he would shout back to the surveyor, tally. So that's how they would measure land. And when I give living history demonstrations at historical sites, I always try to get kids involved to do what I just described. And they enjoy that, and they learn a little bit about it, because I've asked the question many times, do you know what surveying is? And I've had answers, yes, it's when somebody calls you on the phone and wants to ask you a bunch of questions. So now they've got a little better understanding. I asked them, do you have a front yard? Yes. Do you have a backyard? Yes. Do you live next door to someone? How do you know when you're in their yard or in yours? So try to get the kids interested in that. You know, do you play baseball? Surveying? Yes.
How do you know which direction to head off?
That's a good question. The question is, in case you didn't hear it, how do you know what direction to survey in? That's the surveyor's choice. Now, he may already have some idea from the person that hired him. And in colonial times, most of the hiring was done by the colonial assembly. There were businessmen who hired, or companies who hired surveyors for a particular reason. But it would depend on what the surveyor has been instructed, what his job is to be. If he is going to survey a boundary, then there's probably, because of meets and bounds, some idea of where the boundary already is. Okay? So he would go there, pick him out a spot, and say, okay, this is where we're going to establish the surveying boundary. Okay? Now, I said when you stretch this chain out 10 times, that's 1 tally. 8 tallies is 1 mile. If you stretch it out 10 times, or 1 acre is 10 square chains. You follow me? So you stretch it out 10 times, then you make a right angle, and you go 10 times, and 10 square chains. Stretch it 1 time, and it's 10. 10 squared this way, 1 this way, that's an acre. Yes, sir?
They had already developed an acre, or the acre came from 10 times 10 square chains.
That question's worth 2 peppermints.
About a mile.
The mile goes back to the Romans.
Okay.
Statute mile, I think that goes back to the Romans, 5,280 feet. What was your question?
I'll ask it again. I might get was the acre already established, or did they
The acre.
the 10 square chains was what they were going to call it?
That is a good question. During the time when meets and bounds were in use, and they still are, but they're no longer the dominant measurement. The definition of an acre, and there are two that I know of, but it may be more. One of them is the amount of land required to support a family. So that's not necessarily very accurate. Okay, there's a lot of variables in there. The second definition that I've read about in researching is the amount of land a team of oxen can plow in one day. And that seems to be the prevailing definition of an acre during this period of time. Then Edmund Gunner has his chain, and it becomes consistent and definitive. This is an acre.
13,560 square feet.
Exactly. That's what's contained in an acre. Now, one thing about the chain, you see the links on this, they are a specific dimension here, 7.92 inches. Okay? When Edmund Gunner invented this chain, he made it 100. He took that 66 feet, divided it by 100, and that's what he got, 7.92. He did that for a reason, and the links are not numbered like a tape measure is. You measure something with a tape measure, it's going to be from left to right, 1, 2, 3, like it. You can measure from either end with this. So old maps, and some of you may have some, old maps have the dimensions of the property listed not in feet, but in chains. For instance, one boundary may be listed as 150 chains and 45 links. And I've seen maps, old maps, with that description on there. So you can see, now my chain here, and again it goes back to economics, it cost a little bit more money to buy one 66 feet, so I bought one 33 feet. And it's easier to handle with kids. So this one is smaller. I think 12 inches? I have absolutely no idea. I'm not going to shoot you a line. I don't know. I don't know where 12 inches came from, or a yard. You want a peppermint? All right, all right, all right. I'll get you a peppermint. King's foot was 12. That's a big foot. I doubt seriously a human foot was that big back in those days. You know, I mean, some modern day basketball players may have one that way, but so anyway, this was surveying, this chain. This was the workhorse. This is what I demonstrate at Living History demonstrations. And I'll go to Walnut Grove before the COVID thing, and I had been going to Camden. Musgrove Mill is where I go most of the time for this. Any other questions at this point?
Roy, I'd like to pull an ask something.
Yes, sir.
Roy Crawford, who built the Joanna School, and many other things, was probably the surveyor for excellence of Lawrence County. I've worked with a modern surveyor with all the instruments and satellites, and he would tell me to back up 2 inches and scratch the ground, and that was Roy Crawford's stake. He was that accurate.
I've been asked that very question. How accurate were colonial surveyors compared to today? Yes, sir.
How did they handle uneven ground? Did they stretch the chain over the ravine or just let it lay on the contour on the ground? Because that would give you a different distance.
Yes, it would. Yes, it would. There's two answers to that. One is you try to keep it straight and level. okay? Because if you're in hilly country, it is going to make a difference. Again, it goes back to who hired the surveyor and what is his ultimate goal? What does he want to get out of knowing that this land's been surveyed? How much is he paying? Because it's getting value on it. So if he goes down the hill and up, yes, it's going to be more feet involved, yes. It was done both ways. It was done both ways. Stretching it and letting it lay on the ground and pulling it tight. And then when you got in the hill of country, it depended, like I said again, it depended on what the surveyor wanted. Yeah, now if it was gentle slope, there's probably no big issue. But if you're up in high mountains where it's difficult to walk or climb, then they would probably, they would either hold it as high as they could and go maybe, instead of stretching it, they would go 15 lengths and work their way up. But that was more time consuming. So there's a lot of variables that played into that. Yes, sir. It was about the same. It was in use during the colonial time. As far as a particular date, I don't know. It's possible. George Washington did not use a tripod. He used what they call a Jacob staff, which is a single pole with a brass point on it, and you'd stick it in the ground, but somebody had to stand there and hold it. I've seen a couple of those. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Now, during the war, surveyors were still active in surveying land?
During the war, Revolutionary War, there probably was, but George Washington had under his command surveyors to map roads. Yes, sir. Yes. That is one thing that I stress. Surveying is not only measuring land, but for buildings. There you go. There you go. Now his has the levels on them, so you can hold it level. This is Mr. Talbot, right? Tarbert. He is a professional surveyor, but he's retired. Me, it's just a hobby. So I asked him before I got up here, to tell me if I'm not saying anything, if I'm saying something incorrect. But
can I tell a quick story?
Sure.
Some of you may remember John Curry, lived up in Gray Court community, Springship Church Road. I'd done numerous surveys for him, and he was getting ready to move into town. He called me up and said, I want you to come by and he'd talk to me. I went back to the barn and he pulled out a wooden box and opened it up. And there was this totally black piece of metal. He said, you know what that is? I said, Mr. John, that's a step. I said, I'd love to buy that from you. He said, no, sir, it's not for sale. I said, I understand. I'm going to give it to you.
Whoa.
And it was solid black. My wife took it home with polished and all on it. Unfortunately, the disc of it was silver. She polished it. She took all the silver off it. That's where that came from.
Thank you for sharing that.
18th century? No, this is probably 19th century. Yeah, it's not going anywhere. I'm saying it's got that thing going. It's still quite old. Colonial New York, they were against the measure. It's not colonial, but it's the same thing.
Thank you for sharing that. The technology today has advanced so much that's similar to it. Yeah. The technology today. I got invited some years ago. I got invited by a lady to go speak at a dinner in an association that was meeting down in Prosperity, and she said, "Come dressed in your period clothing, your 18th century clothing." She said she was going to do the same. We get down there, and the room was filled with men. I think she was the only woman there. And she said, Walter, I'd like to introduce you to the Surveyors Association of South Carolina. And I started backpedaling real quick then because this is my hobby. This is not my profession. But they had not seen some of this equipment. And from the conversations I had with them, the surveying is now so accurate. It gets down in below, less than an inch. And they can even give you the elevation. Yes?
Ask forward what a modern surveyor's equipment costs right now. What they use in the place for that.
I have no idea. Well, you can ask him. You can. Yeah. So we've talked about, yes, sir. This? I really don't know the answer to that. All I could do was speculate. It would not be cheap, but $10 back in that time was a lot of money. So I have no idea, but the Rittenhouse brothers made their living doing this. So, and they were quite skilled with it. They were in Philadelphia, and they would take orders. They would hear that somebody in another location needed this, and they would work on it, and it would take, all this handcrafted. It would take a while to get it done. Mm-hmm.
In the town, they'd have to be way more accurate than they would out in the country, right?
What now?
They'd have to be way more accurate in town than they would out in the country, wouldn't they?
The surveying equipment be more accurate in town?
They'd have to be closer to surveying.
Well, the accuracy and the dimensions would be much tighter because of the proximity to one building to another. Yeah, you're right about that. So we've talked about the concept of land ownership evolving. It changed from kingdoms and territories owned by a single individual, a monarch. Then it began to develop into metes and bounds and measurement, and land began to have an economic value that could be traded. But when Columbus made that voyage and discovered all this land over here, and what was in the land in the way of natural resources, that became very important to the people in Europe who were financing these voyages. And so the colony of Carolina was, the control of the Carolina colony was given to the Lord proprietors. Are y'all familiar with that? Okay. I only know one of them by name, Lord Ashley. There were 7 others. Really? Craven. They were given complete control over the colony. They had a financial vested interest in the success of this colony. They wanted these natural resources developed so they could get even wealthier. But how do you do that? How do you develop the natural resources and market them? Well, you got to have people. Not everybody in Europe could afford to get over there to the New World. So some of these Lord proprietors had people working under them, said, okay, we're going to establish this program where we will offer 100 acres to the head of the household, 50 acres to the wife, and 50 acres to each child. If a family will agree to go over there and work, we will promise them this land, this much land. So that enticed people to leave their home, their country, and come to the New World because they wanted to have their own land. It was a passion for them, just as much as freedom of religion. There were people that came looking for adventure, looking to get rich, freedom of religion, but there was a lot of people that came because the land was available, being made available. There were so many coming that townships had to be developed. And then I'm going to get into the why part of that a little bit later. But township, this is what a township looks like. It is a grid of surveyed land. A township is 6 miles by 6 miles. Each one of these is a 1 mile square. They are numbered starting in the northeast corner, and they come to the northwest corner, drop down and reverse, and go back and forth. And if you look at Township 16, it's probably as close to the middle as you can get. And when this was being surveyed for public lands, this particular section would be reserved for public schools. That's going to be on your test tomorrow. So, township, this is what it looked like. And these lines here, this grid work, matched up with longitude and latitude. Okay? So the surveyor had to know what he was doing. And an interesting side note, some of you may know this, Daniel Boone was a surveyor. Okay? He was hired by our fur trading company to go into this lands, this wilderness, and make a survey. And he was pretty good at it, not to have any formal education. But he had one flaw that we know of, and that is he never went to the recording office and documented what he'd done. And so if a particular family or business asked him to survey something, he would do it, they'd pay him. But then, because it wasn't recorded, another party would come in, survey the same land. So Daniel Boone spent the last years of his life in court because he'd failed to do that. So now you take a township that has 36 one-mile sections in it. You break it down to what you see there. It's 640 acres in a township. Now, in a section, 1 mile section, 640 acres in 1 mile section of a township. A township in and of itself has between 20,000 and 23,000 acres of land. So a half section is 320 acres. You can break that down to a quarter section. My grandparents had a quarter section, 160 acres. 80 acres is 1/8, 40. And if you get anything smaller than a 40, it's usually described as lots. Okay. Let's just reach in the grab bag this time. I was hoping somebody would ask about that. Yes, it was. But I had it in my notes. I may mention that. You're exactly right. 40 acres and a mule. That is a phrase that came after the Civil War. What happened is in the lower part of the state, from Savannah going along the coastline almost to Charleston, and then about 6 miles inland, that area was confiscated by the Union troops. And who was the Union commander at the time? William Tecumseh Sherman. And he made that famous march, and that land was confiscated to the federal government, taken away from the people that, the plantation owners. And it was given to the slaves, the freed slaves at the time. And each family was given 40 acres. So a group of them got together and they went to see General Sherman and says, we appreciate all this, but we have no way to work the land. Can we buy some mules from you? He said, no, you can borrow them. So he loaned them mules, and that's where the saying came from, 40 acres and a mule. So let's look at this one now, into the townships. Between 1731 and 1765, these were the townships that had been surveyed in the colony. And I think there's 11 of them. But you have down here a French colony, 1730. Up here you've got a French colony, 1740. And when I say colony, I'm referring to the people who settled in that area. Okay? The ethnic groups. Palatine Germans. Who's that? Newberry. In 1740, this township was populated mostly by German folks, Germans here. I did not have the information on the others. And you can see by the shape that there are several of them that are not perfect squares, okay? They took into account natural land features, geographical features, rivers, and that would be one border rather than surveying a straight line. Notice where most of them are. Mid-state, middle of the state. 1730s, this was the wilderness. This was out west. This was the back country. Cherokee, some Catawba mixed in with it. Catawba more in this area. We've got one down here, and there's a particular reason for that one. What's in this area? Georgia, and then beyond Georgia was Florida. So who was in Florida? And they were advancing north? Spanish. So the people that lived in Charleston in this area, they were the old folks. They were the ones that had been there for a couple of generations at least. And they were afraid of the Native Americans here, waging war on them. And we won't get into the reasons why. But so these townships were surveyed in this area to protect these folks. That's what they were, a buffer zone. That was the secondary reason is you got all the immigrants coming wanting land. Let's give them these. So that's why this happened that way.
At that time, Charlotte was there.
Charlotte, North Carolina? Charles, I don't know. I don't know when Charlotte was founded.
Well, I mean, there was a dispute between North and South Carolina until, I think, 1772 or something like that.
It might have been a little bit earlier than that, but yeah, there was a dispute. Yes.
You see straight lines on a boundary map. That's a surveyed boundary as opposed to being bound on a river or canyon or whatever, a mountain crest. That probably came from a boundary dispute between North and South Carolina. One of the legislatures of both agreed to get it surveyed. The original charters.
You're correct with that. But what prompted it was the Native Americans living in this area. They didn't want to be a part of South Carolina. And I believe it was the Catawba. But if you look at a geographical map, the Cape Fear River is right here. Okay? The original land grant for the colony of South Carolina included what is now North Carolina, okay? And it went all the way to the Pacific Ocean.
The lines on the map, the coastline that be marked and just go
Off into infinity.
straight out to wherever.
So what happened was they said, okay, we're going to survey a straight line from the mouth of the Cape River up to this parallel, this latitude. When we get to that latitude, we're going to turn west. And then we got right here, Indians say, hey, wait a minute. We object to that. So this is the Catawba River right here, that little part. And then it continued on. So you're right, the legislatures got involved, the court cases and all that, so that's another story. But anyway, townships provided two things. They were the buffer zone to protect the coastal folks, and it gave the opportunity for people to own land, which is the topic of my first book over there, The Adventures of Robert Steele. He surveys a township right in this area. It's a fictitious township, but he's going to survey it near what is present-day Camden. Okay. Macaulay, can you help me with the next one? Let's just move one of these up. We'll use this one. I don't have a fancy slide projector, and y'all feel free to look at this up close when we're done. As you can see, this is a map of the United States. Don't let it fall, Macaulay, for me. It's a map of the United States with the 13 colonies, then the land acquisition after the Revolutionary War, the Louisiana Purchase, and then other purchases and areas of land. After the American Revolution ended and we won our freedom, we also won all of the land east of the Mississippi River. Now, if I had been a soldier during that time and survived and got to an old age, I was entitled to a pension. But the new Congress of the United States didn't have a lot of money to pay a pension, but they had a lot of land. So my pension was given to me in the form of land, but it had to be surveyed. So the United States Congress hired a fella, now write this down, it's on your test tomorrow. His name was Thomas Hutchins, and gave him the title of the General Surveyor of the United States. This is in 1795. And they told him, your job is to go survey the western lands. So where would you start? You want another peppermint. He picked him out a place right here in a small village called East Liverpool, Ohio. The town is still there today. But his point of the beginning is underwater right now. But there is a historical marker that says 100 feet from here, the point of the beginning. He started surveying all public lands, and he worked on his task for 5 years, surveying it in the form of townships. And then he retired. But if you get a closer look at it, you can see, and it looks fuzzy back there, all of this has been surveyed that way.
Nobody has road maps anymore, but when you look at a road map, for instance, of Ohio, you'll see where the townships got adjusted the latitude. There'll be a little jog in the way that the squares line up.
If you look at some of your old land deeds, they're going to have the name of the township on it. And I've got one at the house that's 1965. It still has the name of the township on the land deed. Now, someone in a previous meeting asked, well, why is Texas not showing that small, everything's bigger in Texas? You know, I don't know. land grants had a lot to do with surveying and ownership of land. So that may be one reason that this map was printed in 1965. So that may be one reason. But it was labor intensive. Of course, as technology advanced, and it wasn't until after the Civil War that these sight veins were replaced with a transit. Okay? Now, we've talked about the idea of land ownership, an individual owning it. We've talked about meets and bounds and the surveying and how it evolved. And we've talked about townships. Between 1731 and 1759, there were 9 townships here. But who created the idea for a township? Now, this is going to give you extra bonus points. Who created the idea for a township system? Township system is a land management system, and it is the measurement of specific land, acreage. So who created that idea? It was a British officer in the British Army. His name was Colonel John Barnwell. Does Barnwell ring a bell? Yes, sir. Let's give him a grab bag prize. John Barnwell's Barnwell County, isn't it? Oh. It was his idea, but he was a colonel in the Army, and that's about the extent of his putting it into practice. But Governor Robert Johnson of the colony of South Carolina put it into practice in the year 1730 is when that started, this system started.
Well, so the townships, the land was given, or was it purchased?
To the people that settled in the townships, it was given to them. They had to work. They worked for it. They didn't have to pay money for it. They worked for it. Yeah.
I don't know if the map shows county names for a state like Ohio, but the 4 westernmost counties, first one's named Defiance, Fort Defiance, Madison, Wayne, Fallen, Timbers, the Indian Wars. But the next 3 are Wyndham, Paulding, and Van Wert. Those are the 3 guys that captured John Andre, the go-between between Benedict Arnold and the British, and exposed the plot to give away West Point. Those 3 counties were land given to those 3 men.
Really? Okay. Okay. So that about winds it up as far as telling about the history of land ownership, surveying, and townships. I tried to encompass everything that I've said and what is written in the notes, and I appreciate you getting those notes too. They're for you. There may be some left on that round table over there, I don't know. But it was this idea that prompted me to write my first book, The Adventures of Robert Steele. He's my ancestor, okay? I just made the story fictitious about him, okay? He's an indentured servant at the age of 16, and his father signs a contract with a landowner already living in Charleston. And so he sells by him, he comes alone to the New World at 16 years of age, secures his contract, and is assigned to a land surveyor working in the employee of his boss, his Mr. Ward, the landowner. He learns about the hardships of the backcountry. He experiences them. He's more mature at the age of 16 than a 16-year-old would be today. So So he makes his way. He learns how to make his way. And then the sequel to that is also over here. It's part of a three-part story that I'm trying to tell. The sequel is that they go farther into the back country to establish commerce with the Cherokee. And I'm going to mention this to you as well, and you probably already know this. During this time, with few exceptions, the Native Americans were referred to by their people group name: Cherokee, Catawba, Yamasee, Creek. They were not called Indians. But there were few exceptions to that. If they were not called by their name of their people group, they were called hostiles. Okay. Or in some cases, when somebody was angry, savages. But they were people groups. And to establish commerce with them would be to the advantage of the Cherokee as well as the colony. So Robert Steele takes this undertaking, and he goes through and he experiences various trials, and he begins to fall in love. So it's not a tearjerker, but it's... Any other questions? Yes? There is a distinction between when you say property ownership. If I'm a military commander or a king or a knight, I can go out and conquer and say, this is now my land, okay? But as far as the individual owning his own land, that was unheard of.
Well, in the progression of society, you have family, clan, tribe, which is associated clans, and associated clans become a nation. Nation doesn't have fixed boundaries. It moves.
Well,
It doesn't identify itself because it's usually not in contact with any other nation. Europe was so densely settled that they ended up butting heads, and a frontier there became known as an imaginary line between two nations, and you end up with boundaries and countries. Now, who owned the land of the country was the head of the nation, which was the king.
right.
And he could loan it out to whoever he pleased. You did me a great favor in battle, I'll give you this section.
In essence, that's what the King of England did with the Lord Proprietors. Okay? Yes.
One thing, it was about 1749, grandfather of mine went to England. He was lieutenant governor in New Hampshire. He paid £1,250 for territory and brought the deed back to Boston Bay Colony, and that became Maine. And New Hampshire did not become part of Massachusetts because of this idea of giving somebody something for favor.
Mm-hmm.
Because they want Massachusetts, they want to make that
Yeah.
one state. And the only reason you have a New Hampshire because it was double out.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to be around here if you have any other additional questions. Just come up to me. Otherwise, I'm going to say we're going to wind it up. Okay? I do have these books over here for sale.